Okay, so we talked about four different kinds of products or goals of scientific research. Namely, those are description, prediction, causal explanation, and comprehensive causal models. Okay, so ultimately, uh, scientific research in psychology is aimed at providing some sort of explanation, not just describing people's behavior. Of course, there is a question about then what is the difference between description and explanation. Philosophers, psychologists do not have a clear consensus on what makes explanation different from description. But overall, people seem to somewhat agree that explanation involves some sort of mention of causation. So you can see these two examples in the slide. So example of description is males tend to be more promiscuous than females. It's just describe how males' behavior different from females' behavior. On the other hand, explanation seems to include why that's the case. Namely, such as male have less reproductive investment. Males are unable to be 100% sure whether a given offspring is his, and having multiple sexual partners is advantageous towards successfully passing on one's genes. So these things can cause males to have be advantageous in showing certain other kinds of behavior. So explanation tends to increase the sense of people's understanding. So the difference between explanation and description is psychological. So the key, why do we need to talk about this? The key idea is in the last sentence of this slide, which means explanation and description requires different kinds of data as an evidence to support the claim. So that means, say that if your aim of the research is to merely describe it, one kind of evidence is required. But on the other hand, if your goal is to provide explanation, you need to have different kinds of evidence. That's why we need to talk about this issue. So in the previous slide, we talked about the difference between explanation and description. And we also talked about the importance that depends on the purpose. That means whether your purpose of the research is description or explanation, you need different kinds of evidence. So here we focus on description focused research. The goal of the description focused research is to describe the population that you are interested in. For example, the evidence is you may be interested in what's the percentage of the college students, UAA students who have a depression. So in this case, the population is a UAA student. So in order to have an accurate description of the UAA students, you need to have representative sample of UAA students. Because if it's not representative sample of the UAA students, your description based on the sample is not an accurate description of the population that you are interested in. The other thing is, say that your description is about the relation between depression and the number of classes taken. So in this case, the method that you may be applying may be correlational research, as your question is about the relation between these two different kinds of variables. Still, this is the description of the relation between these two variables. Therefore, the same logic applies that you still need to be really concerned about the representative sample of the population that you are interested in. Okay, so for both descriptive research, whether the description is about single behavior, that means single variable, or about the relations, you have to really pay attention to the nature of sample. Namely, it needs to be representative of the population that you are interested in. In explanation focused research on psychology, the purpose of the research is mostly to provide something called causal explanation.
So example of causal explanation is why male sex is more promiscuous in general than female, or why certain kinds of study strategy results in better learning, or why certain kinds of behavioral intervention works better than other kinds of behavioral intervention in improving the mental health. Okay, so the key here is so in order to establish causal explanation, you have to note that uh, what is actually needed to establish causality. So these are the three different kinds of criteria that's needed to establish causality. Number one is covariation. Number two is temporal precedence. Number three is elimination of alternative explanations. And each of these concepts are explaining here. Okay. In previous slide, we discussed establishing causal explanation or causality requires three different kinds of criteria. In this particular slide, we talked about the first criteria, which is covariation. Covariation means when A changes, B changes as well. And the most common way of measuring the extent or the direction of covariation is measuring correlation. So for example, when X increases and Y increases as well, we observe positive correlation. When X increases, Y decreases as much, then we see negative correlation. The second criteria for establishing causality is temporal precedence. Temporal precedence concerns the fact that cause must happen before an effect. So for example, let's assume that you believe that exercise causes people to become happy. So in that case, exercise and a cause and increase the happiness as an effect. So in order for you to establish cause is actually exercise and effect is a happiness, you need to the cause of exercising needs to happen before measuring or observing the increased happiness as an effect. The third criteria for causation is elimination of the third variable problem or alternative explanation. So let's talk about this using an example such as ice cream sales and commission of violent crime. So you observe ice cream sales, increased ice cream sales, and increased the violent crimes. But that could be caused by something else. Namely, in this situation, it's usually it's a hot weather. Hot weather causes ice cream sales to goes up, and also the hot weather uh, increases the violent crime. So in that sense, in order for you to actually establish it's an ice cream sales actually causing the people to become violent, this third factor of high temperature needs to be eliminated. So let's talk about this in using different kinds of example. Let's say that you have you see the exercise and happiness is positively correlated. So you start believing exercise may actually increase happiness, or happiness increases exercise. But it could be there may be another factor, such as socioeconomic status. The people with a lot of money or high socioeconomic status may actually exercise more and may be happier. So in that case, basically, in order to establish your causality, presumed causality, or hypothesized causality of exercising increases happiness, you need to eliminate the possibility that it's actually more money that's causing both. That's the basically elimination of the third variable. So this slide discusses what kind of method is most appropriate in establishing causality. Correlational analysis of natural observation or survey is not appropriate to establish causation because even though these kind of study may be able to give you covariation, data on covariation, temporal precedence, and its ability to eliminate the third variable program is not the part of the design of these studies. Okay, so temporal precedence is not controlled because typically the survey measures two or more variables as a part of the survey in which the order is not controlled. Number two, if you ask only two questions like how often you exercise and then how happy you are, there are lots of different kinds of possibilities about the status of the person's socioeconomic status and other different kinds of individual differences. That becomes basically the part of uh, the situations. So these are not appropriate. So that leads to the experimental study that we need to talk
So here we talk about basics of experimentation. All the important details are mentioned and self-explanatory in the slide. So I'm going to just focus on some two very important issues. The purpose or the goal of experimentation is to achieve high internal validity. This means you have the confidence on the degrees to which independent variable, which is your designated cause, is the only cause of change observed in the dependent variable, which is the effect. Okay, so that is the single most important thing about experiment. So when you assess or evaluate experiment, your focus is whether or not that particular experiment has a high internal validity. That is the most important thing. So how are you going to achieve that? That means you are eliminating all the other kinds of possible interpretation. That means the other variable might be causing it, the effect that you observe. So the single most important things in the experimentations to increase the internal validity is randomly assign the people into two or more conditions that selectively manipulate only one and variable. This should be so because even if you have the control condition and experimental condition, if you end up having different kinds of people in these two different kinds of conditions, the effect cannot be completely attributed to the variable that you manipulated. Random assignment is going to ensure that these two different groups of people in two different conditions have approximately similar kinds of people, therefore preclude or exclude the possibility that the effect that you observed is caused by something other than your manipulation. That's the most important things in experimentation.
about. The gist of this slide with regards to experimentation is the most important thing is the purpose of experimentation or the things that you need to be careful about experimentation is to maximize internal validity. What is internal validity? Internal validity means your confidence in that the observed changes in the dependent variable is caused only by your manipulation of independent variable. When you have high confidence in that internal validity, this means this change that you observed in the dependent variables could not be happen without your manipulation of independent variables. Then you can be really sure independent variable, which is your manipulated cause, resulted in the observed effect. From here on some of these extra slides, I'm going to bring in purposefully to kind of improve your understanding of the complexity in the causality, this issue about complex issue about causality. Namely, what you need to, I would like you to know is there are two different kinds of causality. That is basically a cause is sufficient or a cause is a necessary cause. So ideal situation is cause should be both necessary and sufficient. Then the story become much easier but cause is not often necessary but not sufficient, or sufficient but not necessary. Especially in psychology, this is an important. So let's think about schizophrenia. Genetic predisposition is a necessary cause for having a schizophrenia. However, genetic predisposition is often not just is not sufficient by itself. Some sort of environmental factors are important. That's why we need to talk about sufficient and necessary cause. Okay, so the best way for you to understand the difference between sufficient and necessary cause is to have a specific example. The example that I'm using is sufficient cause is like, for example, when you poke your eyes, uh, you will become blind. But that's not necessarily cause, because the reason is there may be alternative way in which you can go blind. Okay, what about necessary cause? I would say example necessary cause is an oxygen for explosion. In order for explosion to happen, usually you need oxygen, because without an oxygen, burning cannot happen, because the explosion is a quick way of actually burning, very specific quick way of burning. Therefore, oxygen is necessary cause. So if this doesn't help you, you should come up with your own example. And we talk about this in some subsequent slide. We already talked about why do we talk about complex causality, in particular in psychology. Often the psychological cause is the causes that we deal with in psychology is there's a complex causality, because many things actually interact, like we talked about schizophrenia. Therefore, I would like you to be mindful that we are dealing with a very complex situation. Therefore, you need to keep separate. The cause may be just necessary but not sufficient, or just sufficient but not necessary.
So by now, you may have realized that this notion of causality is very, very complicated, especially in the area of psychology. Genetic predisposition causes schizophrenia. People say that. But that doesn't mean that's the only thing that's going to cause schizophrenia. So it's much more complicated. So when I look through all these literature, philosophy, psychology, and many different places, the best understanding or the notion or approach that captures the complexity of causality is proposed by this person by the name of Mackey in 1965. It's called Inus condition. This is the abbreviation. So Inus refers to this sentence. Let me read this aloud. Insufficient, but necessary parts of a complex set of factors that together are unnecessary, but sufficient for resulting in an effect. That is the Inus condition. This sounds very wordy and abstract, so let's kind of talk about this in using an example. Heat and oxygen are both insufficient in itself. They require other things, but necessary. No fire occurs without them being present is a part of a complex set of factors that together are unnecessary because there are multiple possible combinations, but sufficient for starting a fire. So the example in more concrete cases where a short circuit can cause a house to burn down, we also have to consider the collection of surrounding events, the short circuit, the proximity of flammable materials, and the absence of firefighters. None of them are in itself the ultimate cause. So therefore, together these are unnecessary, but sufficient to the house's burning down, since many other collections of events could have led to the house burning down. Okay, so don't worry too much about the exact wording. I want you to get the idea that this causality, especially in the context of psychology, is not one to one, one cause and one effect. It's much more complicated. Okay, probably the reason why we tend to think about one cause and one effect is because of our attention to a particular things. But when you really look into the nature, it's much more complicated. That's why I'm bringing this up, and I want you to appreciate the complexity, which is going to probably affect your way of thinking, how to kind of treat or how to approach psychological disorders, and so on. So,
In this particular slide, I bring up the fact that this idea of causation, even though we casually talk about it, is a very complex issue. And many philosophers and cognitive psychologists are not completely sure about what exactly is a causality. Okay, so I want you to kind of at least understand and appreciate this causality that we talked about is a very, very complex issue. So, at the least, I would like you to be mindful that a cause can be necessary but not sufficient, or sufficient but not necessary. Okay, and then so this slide kind of elaborate what do we mean by necessary cause and what do we mean by sufficient cause. So please read the content of this slide carefully and hope that you understand the difference between them. This slide and the next slide talk about why we are differentiating whether the cause is necessary cause or sufficient cause. Namely, the reason why is depending on whether you assume that a cause is necessary or a cause is sufficient, it affords different kinds of inferences. For example, here, let's say that you are making a predictive reasoning, right? And then if you believe A is a necessary cause of B, if A is a necessary cause of B, let's say A is present, is B present? I want you to think about this. Now A is not present, is B present? So this means depending on your assumption that whether a particular cause that you are thinking about is necessary or sufficient, your predictive reasoning of whether or not you can infer the presence of consequence based on the cause. That means effect based on the cause is actually different. Okay? And similar things happen with diagnostic reasoning. Like, let's say effect is present. Is cause present? Effect is not present. Is cause present? And the next slide give you an answer. I would like to think about these possibilities to kind of train yourself and become familiar with something called causal reasoning. And even though this looks kind of tedious and complicated, many of you and actually all of us are doing this reasoning on a daily basis. So it's important for you to recognize these are the kind of reasoning that we do on a daily basis. So this slide continues from the previous slide and give basically the answer as well as an example of how the causal reasoning, namely the predictive reasoning based on effect given the cause, or diagnostic reasoning of cause given the effect, happens depending on whether or not you believe the cause is necessary or sufficient. So I would like you to pay attention to each of these examples and establish your understanding. So this slide contains the summary of what we've talked about in the previous two slides. Okay, so that means basically predictive reasoning or diagnostic reasoning for each of the case of whether the cause is necessary or cause is sufficient. And you can see, as you can see, let's assume that A is a necessary cause of B, and if you observe A is present, is B present, you cannot have a conclusive actually inference, because even if it's necessary, it's not. You don't know whether or not it's sufficient to cause basically the effect of B. Okay, and then on the other hand, if the A is not present and if you believe A is necessary, you can be sure that B is not present. Okay, like this. And then so this example on the top half list all these different kinds of examples And I would like you to visit each of these examples, and hopefully you develop better and more differentiated understanding of how these causal reasoning works.